What kind of age range? All the folks with 0 to 5s? High five to you. I have a 4-year-old, yay. 6 to 10, a few more. 10 into those teen years. All right. And anything older than that? All right, so yeah, we are here tonight to talk about race and having conversations around race with our children, regardless of what age they are. Our focus tonight is kind of going to be on those on a little bit on the younger end, kind of 0 through to round about 10, because we know it's never too soon to start having these type of conversations, as difficult and as tough as they can be. Before we get into it, though, how many of you have had conversations with your children about race? So pretty much everyone. So this is really a participatory event. The whole reason why we're doing this is not just for the folks in the room, also for the folks joining us on the live stream. This will go up online at kpcc.org, so you'll be able to share this with friends and family afterwards. But we're really trying to provide people with tools and resources. It's difficult talking to kids about a lot of things. I haven't got to the point that I've had to have the birds and the bees talk yet. Thank goodness. I'll probably have to ask some of you how to do that. But race is something that we really kind of can't get around. So as much as our experts are going to be giving us advice, it's also a forum for all of you to share your hints, your tips, kind of the crunch points that you've had and all the rest of it. So, feel free to have your questions ready, and we're going to open up the mics for everyone to jump in and have a conversation. Sound good? All right, so before we get started, I actually want to kind of play a little bit of a clip, because we know that if you listen to us here on KPCC, over the past few years, there have been so many conversations around race, especially with regards to people of color and policing, which is really kind of something that sparked this conversation. I just want to play a quick video that comes from an organization called This Matters. Take a quick look, and then we'll get into it.
We actually have a line that we do at our house. We practice this thing. What is it?
I'm Ariel Sky Williams. I'm 8 years old. I'm unarmed, and I have nothing that will hurt you.
It's just kind of a thing we practice at our house.
So that's short. I think actually we'll post that up on kpcc.org within the events page, so that you can see that. It's a really good video. It probably goes on for about 6 or 7 minutes or so, and it's different conversations with parents and their children of different ages, as young as 8 and up. But how do folks feel when they see that, an 8-year-old saying, "Look, if I see a police officer, this is what I'm going to do"? Any initial reactions to that? Yeah, sad. I think when we sent it to our panel, there were a few tears from a few people, for sure. So with that, let's get our panel up on stage. Please come and join us. Give them a warm round of applause. It's actually a little bit of a KPCC alumni reunion tonight. This lovely gentleman to my left is Edgar Aguirre. He is the Director of Talent Development and Inclusion at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Hi there, Edgar.
Hello, Joanne. A pleasure to be here.
Also joining us, we have Rebecca Bernard. She's the co-founder of World City Centre. Good evening to you. Further left, we have Angela Saunders. She is a parent coach with Evolving Parents. Good evening to you.
Good evening. Happy to be here.
And right on the end, and definitely last but definitely not least, we have Nancy Wang. She is Chair and Associate Professor of Sociology at Biola University. Good evening to you, Nancy.
Thank you for having me. Hi, everyone.
And I should actually say that Nancy, in addition to being super professor and super mom, she is also the author of Real Inequality, Hollywood Actors and Racism. So a round of applause for our panel. So I kind of want to jump straight into it. We just showed that little bit of a clip, and I know all of you have had an opportunity to see that full video. But Edgar, reaction from you? How did you feel when you watched that, especially that you have kids 12 and 10 yourself?
Yeah, no. First and foremost, it's a pleasure to be here. KPCC is part of my family. I worked here for half a decade. The whole forum team, Joanne, Johnny, Bob, the whole forum team. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure and an honor. Yeah, it's gut-wrenching, really, that a little person that's 8 years old has to go and be prepared to have that conversation with their parents. Complete amount of empathy for that conversation, but also it's I hate to say it, but you have to have that conversation at this point. There's so much life coming at our kids nowadays with so much access to information and the reality that they're seeing in America today. We have to equip them with those tools. So it's uncomfortable, but yet it's something that has to happen, unfortunately.
Yeah, my daughter is 8 years old, and I saw, when I watched that video all the way through, I was bawling. It's a conversation that I've had tangentially, but not in that way. We don't practice a script yet. And I was thinking to myself, wow, she's 8. She's the same age as that little girl. Like, am I behind? Am I behind on this conversation? Mm-hmm. Am I ready to have this conversation with her? Am I ready to strip her of her childhood and her youth and feeling safe in the street in that way? And is it even an option, you know? Or does that come from a place of privilege to think about it as optional in this day and age?
Angela?
I too was moved by it, because if you watch the full video, which I encourage you all to, there are other parents and other children that are interviewed in it, and it's very moving. And same things like, like your heart breaks and wishes it wasn't even having to happen. But one thing is, I've talked to so many of you on the panel about one of the reasons I talk to my son, who is 7, he turned 7 in December, about certain things is, especially racism, is not to scare him or give him more fears, but to empower him and give him confidence in matters like that. Because if you look at the little girl, like I watched it again, and even that moment, she seemed empowered. There was a confidence to her. And I think that's what comes from having more and more dialogue with our children, raising real critical thinkers. And that's what can happen, because what we saw was just that moment. But I'm curious to know, and what I'd love for us to talk about here is, how did he begin that conversation? How did he teach her to know this is what you say when this happens, and why, and the whys and the explanation? Because that's what's so key, I believe, is explaining to our children why. So it can demystify and release some of the fear and wonder to the whys. And just like, because there are, unfortunately, people who work really hard as police officers, we can empathize with them, but who have been shot at, and they don't trust whoever they see immediately. There are some who are racist. There are some who have more fear for people of color. There are who have shot other people of color. You know, you can just tell them basic facts, and you can tell them what people, that's the thing, is explaining the whys. Sometimes very matter of fact, I think, is what children need, and it helps them. You don't have to go in details and graphic stuff, but just the basics, I think, makes a difference.
Bring in Nancy, your thoughts.
So I think it's great that we're in an age where we can have content creators in digital media, because I think when I was growing up, all I saw was whatever was on TV, right? So the fact that this video exists and it's created by I'm assuming, people of color or people who are empathetic, that this kind of material is out there, and that people can't choose to expose their children or just even themselves being able to consume such videos. I showed this to my daughters, actually,
I did too. I showed it to my son.
Yeah, I showed it to my daughters, who are 8 and almost 10, and they're Asian Americans, and I kind of just showed it to them and just let them ask questions. I didn't actually explain anything. I just thought, what did you guys think? And they just said, oh, it's good. That's what they said. So they didn't have any questions. So, and I didn't prompt them, right? Because I thought, okay, well, because I remember when I watched stuff or was exposed to stuff, maybe I didn't understand it then, but those images stayed with me and the content stayed with me, so that years later, when I reflect on it, I understood them more. So I thought, okay, well, it's just about exposing kids to authentic representations of people of color from their perspective, and not kind of only a dominant perspective where all they have is stuff that maybe lowers their self-esteem or allows them to stereotype other groups, right? Because that's kind of what the dominant media is.
And it's a case of kind of teaching them, how to, as you said, kind of how to be critical media consumers, but we all know, kind of regardless of what age your kids are, they can get into the iPads, they can get into your phones, they can end up watching and hearing things that you may not necessarily want them to. So how do you begin to engineer that conversation so that if they do happen upon something, or there are conversations that happen at school or while they're out in the world that you may not be comfortable with them having, but they're going to happen anyway, how do you broach that? How do you say, look, son, look, daughter, let's start having an honest conversation about race? And Nancy, I'll stay with you.
So one conversation I had with my daughters was the kind of chinky eye thing that kids do, and it starts very young, right? So, and I know that it was happening in my older daughter's class, but she was a little oblivious to it. So I had a conversation with her, and then my 8-year-old was actually listening. I mean, I don't separate them, and so I was saying that that's actually, making fun of Chinese people and making fun of Asians. It's a racist act. And so my oldest daughter was like listening, but my youngest daughter was actually absorbing it. And the week after, it happened to her. So one of her classmates did that to her, and she was able to say to that girl, "Hey, you're making fun of Asians," and she said, and she was defensive. So, and then her little friends were actually said, "No, we agree with her." So she actually was able to even rally her friends around her, and I was concerned, of course. I was like, "Do you need me to talk to your teacher?" And she's like, she thought about it. She's like, "No, if it happens again, maybe, but it's okay for now." So it was just amazing. I had no idea that it was going to happen in her class, but just naming racist acts, right? When it comes up, not like just for me, it's like when something triggers it, or they ask questions, or I know it's going on already, and so it's natural, right? It's kind of organic, but to not be afraid to name it.
Edgar, you had a different issue, and we're going to kind of talk a little bit more about the role of media in these conversations with both of your hats on. But you have 2 children. They are 12 and 10, adopted from northern Mexico, rural northern Mexico, and they came to the US almost 3 years ago now. Right. And their experiences tackling race were very different.
Very different. As a matter of fact, small world, my wife Sonali is here as well, and I was telling the panel, Angie was actually in a panel about 4 years ago, thanks to Ashley Alvarado, about adopted families. And at that point, my wife and I were just starting the process. And small world, Angie and her son and our children are friends. So thank you, KPCC, for many ways. But our stories, making friendships and making families, right? But our kids come from Mexico, and Mexico is compared to America, is a very homogeneous country. There's not a lot of ethnic diversity, right? And my children coming to America has been an intense education on our very complicated history on race and identity. And I think for them, it's been a whirlwind. I remember talking, and I was sharing with the panel, when we try to explore the concept of MLK, right, in African American History Month, our children were asked, we had to talk about slavery and explaining America's complicated history with racism and slavery. And very innocently, our daughter said, well, how come the police didn't stop that? Right? It's just the innocence of how come these injustices, how were these acts perpetrated? And I think for my children, they've approached racism in America, and my wife and I have exposed them and educated them about it from that prism, right? About, well, let's go back in time, and let's try to explain to you something as complex and as complicated as institutionalized racism and slavery and genocide. It's tough, but I think we have to engage our children in a very educated way and not trivialize it, and try to expose them to the enormity of this conversation. And I think they've been really good sports about it. And I think them being kids in Los Angeles, where they go to school with kids that look like them and don't look like them, to have Asian American friends, and to have the whole spectrum of the richness that is Los Angeles, I think has been very formative. But they've done remarkably well in accepting that, and that this is their reality. And another point that I'll make, because my son happens to be a big fan of hip hop, and he's introducing me to new music, and I happen to be a hip hop head from the late '80s, early '90s. And
showing his age.
Yes, I am. I'm like Tribe Called Quest, that generation. But my son's introducing me to like new acts, right? And I was telling Joanne in the panel that, when it comes to the N-word, right? I'm like, son, that's not cool. That you can't, and not that he used it, but he asked. He's like, what does that mean, son? And again, go back and explain, right, the history of why certain terminology is used as, in different ways, and what is acceptable and what is not. It's a lot, but to our kids' credit, they've taken this assignment with aplomb and enthusiasm. I'm really proud of them. They're watching the live stream, by the way. So shout out Alan Griselda. Hope you guys are watching. I'm proud of you.
I just want to say that I'm so glad that we're having this conversation, because I'm getting emotional thinking about it. Because, I just wanted to comment. Today is the anniversary of Martin Luther King's death. Mm-hmm. And that's even something that my son and I talked about today. Because I like to just let him hear the I Have the Dream speech and bring out the book as much as I can and educate him early, and we do. And we were talking about it, and because he's so little, it's only every 6 months. And I've even said today, do you remember who Martin Luther King is? He says, yes, Mommy, he's the one who changed the world for better, to make the world a better place. That's what he did. And when he was really little, and first time he ever watched a speech, and he said, Mommy, is he a superhero? I remember, and I said, yes, he is. He's a real superhero. What was his superpower? And I said, and that's what I said, he changed the world to be a better place. And he remembered that, and I was so moved by that. But I just wanted to comment that it's so powerful. I think they were all here talking about this, and it just moved me. And then when you said that story, I was like, see, that's exactly why we're here, because if you hadn't said that, imagine what that could have been damaging or upsetting, but she was empowered because you just talked to her and just told her. So I'm so glad we're all here. I just want to say that.
I want to bring in Rebecca, because, of course, race literally is not just black and white. There are intersections as well. You grew up as someone who is biracial yourself. What are some of the conversations that you're having with your own child when it's not as simple as, well, you are a black person? There are different cultures that make up your particular being. So what are the conversations that you've been having in your household?
Right. It's been an interesting process. I feel like it's evolved over every year. The conversation happens, and it happens in a different way, right? Because they're more aware of what's happening around them. They're getting external input from their peers at school and from being out in the world. When they were under 4, it was just normal that they had a white grandma and a black grandpa, and a Latino papi and a black my mom, and it just was their identity and their history in terms of their makeup. And now, I realize that my experience growing up biracial is different from my children because their father is black. So they don't walk out. I didn't walk out into the world and people didn't see me as half white. Some did. I will say that. I think in certain situations, I was not given a pass, but there were certain folks that were a little more comfortable with me being a friend because I had a white mother. But I don't walk out into the world and think I'm half white or I'm white. People see me and they see a black woman. And the same thing goes true for my daughter and for my son. My son, actually, the gene pools are interesting. None of my siblings we all have brown eyes, dark brown hair. My son has lighter eyes. And it's been really interesting to see between my daughter and my son how people treat him differently, because he had blue eyes as a baby that are now green, and to see how she internalizes the attention that is placed upon him as a child. So even though my children are black, there are definitely idiosyncrasies and different nuances in their own racial identity and the way that they step into the world just based on their physical characteristics, and equipping them. My son will dismiss people. He doesn't want you to comment upon his eyes. He will literally look at you and go, all right, cool. He's 6. And my daughter, I remember when he was a baby, you'd watch her and they'd be like, oh my God, he's so, oh, you're cute too. And she'd just kind of be like, But so it's been interesting to see how my experience being biracial and growing up in, luckily, this city that is LA, that is so diverse and is so welcoming in so many different ways. My mother's roots are from the Midwest, and that's a very homogeneous crowd. So I can't imagine what my upbringing would have looked like if I had been raised in the Midwest versus being raised in Los Angeles. But it is a conversation that has evolved every year with my kids and their understanding of who they are. It is a constant conversation. who they are in terms of their race identity and where they fit into the world, and empowering them to feel strongly about who they are and feel proud of that, and know that that's not a singular focus. Like, you do have German Dutch roots, and you do have Puerto Rican Cuban roots, and you do have Costa Rica roots, and you have black roots, and you have white roots, and it's all a part of who you are, and that's okay.
I just want to kind of like riff on that a little bit, kind of, you know, that, not tension is the wrong word, but kind of how people reacted to your son and how people were reacting to your daughter. And it actually just reminds me of a conversation that Nancy and I had at a lunch that we had actually just kind of in preparation for this event, of the role that media plays in how young girls of color in particular perceive themselves. You know, kind of within your research and your work, kind of what kind of damage can be caused by the images of race that are out there in the media?
So there's research, psychological research, that shows that for every additional hour of television that is watched, so black girls and boys and white girls, their self-esteems actually go down, and white boys' self-esteems actually go up. So this is television. And so knowing that research and having children, I'm pretty careful with, well, I don't know. I feel like as they get older, I'm less and less careful with their media options, because they can actually choose more stuff. When they were little, I catered more. But one thing that I do is that when I'm watching with them or I'm seeing what they're seeing, is that we talk about it, right? So it's not necessarily about censorship, but it's about being able to discuss all the different kinds of representations. And one of the things is princess culture, right? This is something that is, I think I try to avoid with my children, but it's unavoidable because it's pervasive in society for girls. So I would point out the Disney, because Disney's got the monopoly on princesses, and I would point out the princesses of color, right? Or I don't know if they were all considered princesses, the women of color that are in the Disney portfolio. And I would say, oh, I really think that, I love her skin, or I love her hair, or I love that, I think that she's really beautiful. She's one of my favorites. So I wouldn't say anything bad about the other princesses, but I would just let them know my preferences, right? So that I thought of it as counter programming, because the programming, the natural programming, or the societal programming, not natural, societal, socially constructed programming is that the blonde hair, light eyes, right? And so I wanted to ensure that they wouldn't grow up thinking that somehow their dark hair and dark eyes was less attractive.
And Edgar, that kind of plays into the work that you're doing at the Academy. You know, we've had Oscars So White, a lot of complaints about representation of people of color within the Hollywood movie industry. So as someone who is, let's look at your official title, Director of Talent and Development, how do you go about changing some of those images that Nancy's talking about that can appear to be quite damaging to our children?
Right. No, it's purposeful work, because, my children, again, born, raised in Mexico, now being acculturated here as American kids. Our daughter, beautiful, and she's got beautiful skin that's a little bit darker in tonality, right? And she happens to be a 10-year-old girl that loves princesses and very femmy and loves all the Disney pantheon, right? And I think a couple of months ago, when we took our kids to go see Moana, by the way, show of hands, who's seen Moana here? Excellent film, right? It was just so wonderful seeing a little brown girl be the hero and be the lead, and I was in tears. I love that movie, and plus I'm also on the Hamilton binge, right, with Lin-Manuel Miranda. So it was just beautiful seeing, that could be my daughter aspiring to be a heroine and it's just beautiful and it's powerful. And I think for me, I'm blessed and grateful to have this opportunity at the Academy, because we're trying to, in our own little way, try to empower that more Moanas to be produced. And I think in the industry that we inhabit, it's really about having more people that look like this panel being in the rooms where things are greenlit and that are produced and that are directed and written. And so the work that I'm doing at the Academy is really about how do we develop pipelines for more people from underrepresented communities, more women, to be in the industry so that they can have jobs and they can go up the food chain and be able to greenlight the future Moanas, right? And I tell my kids, when I always have jobs where I have to describe my job in 30 paragraphs, it's very difficult. But I try to explain to my children, right, because they love watching Nickelodeon and watching the Disney Channel, watching Liz and Maddie and other little shows, right, with all these little chatty kids. And I'm trying to tell my son and my daughters, like, look, you see those kids? They got that job because their parents took them to auditions, and you see the video, somebody's behind the camera, somebody wrote that, somebody produced. There's jobs, there's people in those jobs, and I think what Daddy's involved in is trying to make sure that the people that are doing those jobs look like us, look like people that can enjoy this, because we want to be able to see a reflection of ourselves on the screen. And so I'm encouraging my children to be a little bit more analytical about what they're seeing on the screen. It's not an accident that you're seeing those images, and that's powerful. And then secondly, on my daughter, right? We're trying to instill in her a positive affiliation with her tone, because she comes from a culture that, the reality, Mexico and Latin America is having a tremendous challenge in the positive portrayal of people, of its people, the reflection that you see in mass media and the reality of the demographic. There's a disconnect. There's a perception and a projection of beauty that doesn't look like you. And my daughter was impacted by that legacy. And so we're trying to reprogram. We're trying to do what you talked about redefining beauty and saying your skin is beautiful. Are you kidding me? People pay money to go to the tanning booth to look and to have the skin that you have. So trying to reclaim that for both of them. And again, I'm pleased to see that's having an effect. And trying to counteract all the massive amounts of programming that says otherwise.
I was just going to say, and the truth is, it really has gotten a lot better. Like when I think back to
Yes.
the programming that we had, Barbie and Jim, and like I'm dating myself, right? I'm like, sorry, that was so 90s right now. But like the Nickelodeon, even I remember when my children were young, looking at the swath of characters on Nickelodeon, and go, oh, all right. We have evolved past green slime. This is all right. Thank you for including a more diverse character pool, and Disney's getting better as well. But I've also been to your point, Nancy, about like original content creators. Like I rely pretty heavily on YouTube. Like one of my cousin actually has a really wonderful multicultural channel for kids and kids content, and she creates quirky things with kids that look like my kids. And so I let my kids watch that, and so it's been really great to also have the alternative and the original content creators have a platform and multiple platforms for producing their own content and be supported. So.
Well, let's take a look at a little piece of content. We've been talking about films and we've been talking about Disney, but, in recent years there's been a real explosion in kind of regular TV and shows that kind of really reflect what the United States is now. So let's take a little listen or a little watch of a clip from ABC's Fresh Off the Boat.
China just has like pandas. And what's cool about pandas? They're all like, what
What do you mean?
what? Does China amuse you? I was just joking around.
Oh, well, I like jokes. Explain to me what's so funny so I can laugh too.
I think Trent just meant.
I think Trent can talk for himself. He said a joke about China, and I want to know what he meant by it.
Well, should we get involved? Stay out of it. Just stay out of it.
That clip there from ABC's Fresh Off the Boat. Rebecca Bernard, co-founder of World City Centre, I want to come to you and kind of talk about the education component of this. That particular clip was set in a classroom. They were looking at cultures from around the world and, kind of some kind of effort to look beyond, who they see kind of on their street or in their shops. But what is the battle going on in the classroom when it comes to having conversations around race? You have children of all different age groups that you need to speak to in very different ways, but how is it being tackled in the classroom?
Well, I think it's a very delicate conversation. Culture gets trivialized in a lot of ways, and I know we're extremely present to and thoughtful about how we present our cultural curriculum. It's not just it's St. Patty's Day, let's all wear green. It's Cinco de Mayo, which is not really even celebrate. It's not a thing. So it's taking some of these preconstructed notions of what it is to be cultural, study culture, and redefining them in more meaningful ways. We've been playing with it a lot, actually, in the last year from an early education perspective, and our cultural curriculum is a really big part of what we do. We think it's critical to having the children feel whole and complete in their own identities, and we lead from that. We lead from the families that are a part of our community, and we rely on them heavily for their expertise in sharing what it is from their culture that is relevant, that might be meaningful to them as a family and from their own backgrounds. And for the things that we don't know or we're not experts in, we bring in experts. We have invited members from the community to come in and share about things because, I believe too that it's about exposure. That if you keep a monocultural lens on, then you will have no idea what happens outside of your culture or outside of your country. And having had the opportunity to travel a lot myself, I've seen how just even experiencing something, even if it's just a small thing like food, can completely blow a child's awareness out, and push them past the limitations of what they feel are their comfort spaces. And that's where the empathy and the compassion and the dropping of the fear shields happens, because you don't have to be afraid. People are afraid of things that they don't know. And it's easier to be afraid of something that you don't know. But once you've started to introduce things that are different, you can move past. You can move past that fear and be in the exploration and be in the adventure of learning something new and learning about something, whether it's your own personal history or it's the history of somebody else that's sitting right next to you in class. So, from an early education perspective, that's been interesting. I mean, I'm very fortunate. I grew up here in LA, LAUSD, public school kid, 30-year veterans. We've got, shout out to the crowd. I've got Cleveland High in the house right now. And my mother's a 30-year veteran of LAUSD. My best friend is a teacher at Compton High. So I'm still very connected to the public education space right now and how folks are tackling it. And, I've seen some really great programs based in the arts, which I think, finding other ways to tackle this conversation that doesn't necessarily mean hitting it over the head from a philosophical or sociological perspective, but finding more nuanced ways to introduce people into the conversation has been extremely impactful for me.
Can you give us some examples of that?
Well, I remember the race unit 11th grade core at Cleveland High, Humanitas Magnet in the San Fernando Valley, plugging my high school. And I remember we did an exercise where I think it was like the power exercise, where some students were invited to stand up and basically stand over others. And you had to be in that feeling of what does it feel like to be in a position of power versus being in a position of feeling oppressed. And I mean, there were tears. I mean, there were moments of real visceral understanding of what some of these dynamics and some of the institutionalized racism, how it can play out in a really, really small way, like standing in front of your peer. Who's your peer? And oppressing them. I mean, it was extremely powerful. And I know, my best friend, which I referenced, she did a really, really powerful unit using August Wilson plays and using literature and using poetry and using playwriting to express some of these really difficult concepts, that you were talking about earlier about Edgar, about, the historical perspective around race and how it impacts us from both our own personal identity perspective and the institutionalized systems that we are walking through in our lives.
I mean, education extends beyond the classroom. Education also continues at home. And Angela, I know you do a lot of work, kind of educating parents to enable them to be able to educate their children about diversity and inclusion and tolerance of others and tolerance of difference. Just explain to us a little bit about what you do, and especially kind of how you do it using literature, books.
Sure. I'm a parent educator in peaceful conscious parenting through Teach Through Love. And one of the key words you said there was teaching empathy. That's what really the main foundation is, and teaching emotional intelligence to our children at a very young age. And when we teach them how to navigate their emotions, we're teaching them self-regulation. And in this society, what's become more accepted is preventative medicine, where insurance companies will uncover, certain exams, and now chiropractic and different things, So preventative medicine is very good for our bodies. And part of the reason I feel really strongly about this is I think this is preventative mental health for us as human beings, because a lot of us go to therapy and we do inner child work, helping and healing our inner child. But imagine if we could heal our children while they're still children, and by listening to them through empathy, what empathy is truly being present for another human being, letting them have their experience, whether it's crying when they're 2 and 3 because they don't understand their big emotions they're having, when they're really angry and, when they want to take you on and they're like, you're the worst mommy in the world and I hate you, really being present for them and allowing them their emotions. And one of my big mantras for me as a parent is you have to feel it to heal it, and connection before correction with my child. There's still limits, there's still rules, of course, but there's really no punishment. We don't do timeouts. It's not shaming, blaming, or guilt. And it changed our home, it changed our family, it helped change the marriage. Because all these tools, it helped change me, because of course still have to do work on myself. And all these tools, like you say, when you really have tolerance, empathy for themselves and for others, and can identify their own emotions, and then one of the key things we teach is self-regulation with those emotions. So once we allow them to feel it, how can they get through it, to heal it in that moment? And that is what teaches empathy for others. That is what teaches understanding for others. That is what teaches critical thinking. All these things we talk about, what you're talking about, how does that make you feel? And what do you think about that? For anything, even if you're watching a film, reading a book. Little moments where I see it happening with my son. We had this experience, I think I told you or Charlotte, about when reading Madeline, which, classic book, we all love it. And they're all in the line, and they're, with and Mrs. Clavel, and we say something to the good and something to the bad. And Mason, I don't even know if I told my husband this, it's like, there's the robber, the bad guy, he's stealing something. And my son, again, well, how do they know he's bad? That's not nice of them. And I'm like, what do you mean? And he's like, well, I said, just because he's stealing, he could be good. Maybe he had to. Maybe they were hungry. And I'm like, oh my gosh, my little empathetic boy. You're right. I never in all my years thought that when I read this book. And just a moment like that where you realize you're right. And then we got in this conversation of why do people steal? Which gets into a lot of the conversations. And so it's a moment like this when you're just blown away by your own kid. And I'm sure we've all had those moments, little children, just the way they think in their minds. And I've had so many of those. And so that is why I became a parent educator, because I studied with Lori Petro and Teach Through Love, and it changed me. I took a lot of classes and workshops with Dr. Shivali Sabari, who wrote The Conscious Parent, who's been on Oprah and all those things.
And with all of that, how do you... actually, if you haven't had a chance, there are a load of books outside. Don't take them, but do feel free to kind of take a look. But how specifically are you using books to? Your son is now 7.
Yes.
How are you using books to help teach him about empathy and inclusion?
Well, that's it. He taught me in that moment, because I think we have been doing that for so long. When we read a book, we don't sit and stop at every page, but when it's over, we might have a little conversation. Of course, it's bedtime, we're tired, but I brought all those books, and I have so many more. I was trying to choose them, because we have actual books that are little nonfiction children books that literally just talk about the melanin in our skin and why we are the color we are. Now, one thing I didn't mention is we're an adopted family. My son is biracial. His biological father is African American, and his biological mother is little white, blonde-haired, green-eyed German girl, and American, but her heritage. So he knows he's biracial, but he presents white. And he has the curly hair. So anyone who's black knows he's mixed race, and anyone who's white sometimes doesn't. He got the comments on his hair, just like your son with the eyes, where he got uncomfortable with it too. So we read books about that, about what is color, what is race. We have books that are a little bit of nonfiction. We read books. We make sure we find books with total diversity of, like you say, of different colors and different races. We have books on different cultures. When your child loses a tooth here in America, what do? put under the pillow, the tooth fairy. Well, there's this great book about you throw your tooth on the roof, which is about different cultures around the world and what they do when they lose their teeth. And he was totally fascinated by this. And some throw it up on the roof, some bury it, and for the squirrels to come take, or something's going to grow from it. There's all these great cultures. So that, again, creates conversation, because I even noticed in this clip, it was like you said, they were studying Switzerland and China and Russia, different countries and different parts of the world. But we have it right in our backyard. We have so many cultures. We have a neighbor who comes by. She's Russian. She doesn't speak English very well, but her daughter loves our dog, and we always say hi. And so Mason's trying to learn Russian. He'll say a Russian word, or he'll say English word, and little moments like that, like they're from Russia, but they live here in America. They're Russian American. So there's so many ways you can, by reading books and talking about it, like movies. Absolutely, the media. Everyone talked about the movie Zootopia because it was in your face. It was blatant. You had to kind of talk about it. But I'm like,
Don't touch the sheep's hair, folks.
Exactly, yeah. But talk about it all the time when you don't even know. Like she was saying, like you were saying, I was like, that really upset me when that happened, when he treated someone that way in a film, and that character did this, or I noticed this. So we are the models for everything, like how we handle, like I was saying, even our emotions. Our feelings, if we can come down from being angry, they can learn to come down from being angry. If we talk about race, if we talk about things that upset us, that we don't think are fair, that are right, that are just, they will see that. And I think that's really, basically, that's a little bit in a nutshell, just talking about it, expressing your feelings. And again, we were talking even earlier, for little kids, they might ask you one question, how come mommy, blah, 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 and you're like, oh my gosh, this is such a deep question, or how come this happened? Sometimes, because their attention spans are so little, they're just asking a simple question. So it is making it as simple as you can and basic as you can, the little. But when they get older, especially, you may know some of you teenagers here, ask them, don't let it just get away. Don't just think they know. Well, we've taught them. People think that we've taught them, we've told them, but we don't know what happened at school. We don't know what happened out in the world. And so I think it's really key to keep the dialogue going always.
I want to jump to one more clip and start thinking about your questions. We're actually going to open up the floor to questions, because as you can tell, we could probably talk about this all night, but they're going to boot us out at 9. So I want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to talk about that. So I want to play a clip now from, we looked at Fresh Off the Boat. This is actually a clip from Blackish. Let's take a quick look.
Wake up. Let's say they listen to the cops and get in the car. Look what happened to Freddie Gray.
Yeah, and what if they make it all the way to the station?
Mm-hmm.
You remember Sandra Bland?
And let's say they do make it to trial. Mm-hmm. You see where that gets us? Don't you get it, Bo? The system is rigged against us.
Maybe it is, Dre. But I don't want to feel like my kids are living in a world that is so flawed that they can't have any hope.
Oh, so you want to talk about hope, Bo?
So I wanted to play that clip because we remember when President Obama was elected, hope was the word. And after he was elected, the other word that was around was, well, now we're post-racial. Racism does not exist. And kind of in preparation for this, we were doing a lot of reading around living in a colorblind society where kind of race and racism doesn't exist. And there are a lot of written pieces, academic pieces that talk about, kids don't see color. And I've even heard that in my child's own preschool. It's kind of like, well, kids don't know about color. It's like, no, trust, my kid very much knows that he is black. But Nancy, I was kind of curious from a kind of academic point of view, kind of your thoughts on this conversation around colorblindness and the damage perhaps that it can have when it comes to talking about race, especially with our kids.
I think so. Sociologists and race scholars think of that colorblind racism is kind of where we're at in terms of that colorblindness. The idea that we don't see race is kind of used to dismiss racism, right? So I've been accused of being racist for bringing up racism. So it's like things are getting turned on its head in terms of we need to not see race for racism. It's like if we don't see race, then racism is not going to exist. That's the kind of logic behind colorblind racism. And so in Hollywood, this is definitely the case. Like, oh well, we picked the best person right? That's a way to kind of use a colorblind excuse for not casting a person of color, because it's the assumption is that, oh, well, they're not good enough or they're not experienced enough. And so this is a problem, right, in terms of representation. And I think, like you said, kids notice. And I remember my kids go to a predominantly Latino school, Latinx school, and so they would point to the darker skinned friends. So these are their friends, like, oh, they're Mexican, but then all of them are actually Latinx, right? So they noticed that there were color differences, right? But then they associated race with that color, which I just thought, well, this is so strange, right? So I was like, well, you guys, actually everybody is Latinx and many of them are from Mexico. So I think it's just correction, right? And teaching and noting that race exists, right? That we're not in a post-racial society, and that the dangers of using colorblindness is actually counter to progress.
It was actually a really interesting piece in the New York Times, actually, if you get a chance, read it. It was an opinion piece by Jennifer Harvey called "Are We Raising Racists?" And one of the things it talks about this little kid, and she's learning about George Washington, and she comes home and she's very excited about all the things that George Washington has done. And the mother, the opinion writer, kind of says, well, you do know that George Washington had slaves. And the opinion writer says, my child was absolutely devastated because what she was being taught in school was very much about the positive. And I kind of wanted to get the thoughts of the panel on that, especially kind of our educator friends here, of, how do you maintain a level of innocence? How do you teach history while maintaining a level of innocence, but giving kids enough of the facts that they're not shocked when they find out that some of their favorite characters from history, may have engaged in some negativity when it comes to kind of dealing with race. Rebecca?
For me personally, I just kind of have a little bit of a backlash around only the figures that are always celebrated about all of the great things that they've ever done for all of society. And I admittedly probably don't have that conversation about those people as much as I could, only because I think there are other interesting people that also needed to be celebrated and talked about. I think that, this notion of like colorblindness and this notion of only select people being, what do I want to say?
Oh, no. And anyone else, feel free to
if
jump
I
in.
may, as you gather your thoughts, Rebecca,
Yeah.
if I may, like to your question is, how many of you guys have been to JANM, the Japanese American National Museum, lately, right? I happen to be lucky enough to have a friend that works there, and he invited me. There's an exhibit out there for George Takei, right? If you guys haven't seen it, go check it out. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful testimony to his life and being a pioneer. And we were lucky enough to take our kids even before then on something even more silly, but the Hello Kitty exhibit. Remember that a couple years ago? And our daughter loves Hello Kitty. Right? So we took them down there, and it was beautiful, wonderful. But we also went to the Manzanar exhibit, right? And my wife and I went to Manzanar 10 years ago on a trip up to Tahoe. And Manzanar, if you haven't been there, I encourage all of you. You have to. It really makes your hair stand up on your skin. Like, we did this. This happened just 60 years ago. It was nothing. And so to your question about kids, we don't beat them with a stick, right? We're like, let me tell you about America's horrible history on race. It's like on a case-by-case basis. Oh, Hello Kitty. Oh, by the way, check out this little model. What is that, Dad? It's like, oh, these were camps where our government put American citizens because they happen to be of Japanese ancestry, right? And so exposing our little ones, because we have the privilege of them being new to America, right? As we introduce America to them on bite-sized chewables, is to say, and this is a Manzanar, and this is what happens when we're not careful, and this is what happens when we don't pay attention, and this is what happens when we don't respect each other and we don't value each other. It's making it digestible to them without, because I can have a a big loquacious sermon about inequities and stuff, but I lose them after 5 seconds. But if I tell them, oh, Hello Kitty exhibit, oh, Manzanar, what's that? What's that, Daddy? We did that? Yes, we did that.
Kind of putting it.
Put it in like in a reel, and then to see videos of human beings talking about what happened as a little boy. And then at that exhibit at Janum, we went to the bookstore. My wife is the intellectual curator of our family's existence, and let's pick up a book about a little boy who lived through the camp, through this horrible ordeal. A boy from San Francisco that he was interned in Alameda Downs, and his experience with his mom. And my son can relate because my son's 12 and the little boy in the story is 13, 14. That opened up his mind more than anything a classroom curriculum would have done. He associated himself with the little man that went through something very similar. That was beautiful, and I'm very proud of him being able to accept that and try to do that every night with books, with the story about him, with the story about Amelia Earhart, like introducing our kids to the pantheon of American pioneers that have done remarkable work, instead of just getting the George Washington, the Johnny Appleseed stuff. That's great, and I respect that, but let's curate an experience where we surgically reach out to the stories that we want to highlight and expose that to our children. I think that's been really beneficial to us.
And like you said, the age range, like my son loves the one about Ruby Bridges, because she was, at 6 years old, and what she went through. And we have children's books that are age appropriate, where real pictures of what actually happened, and then some have drawings, and that was like so big to him. Wow, she was that little girl, and how brave she was. And even just sometimes like, what is racism? Like that's what this conversation is, and because my son, like, what is it? And it's like you were saying, like there's ignorance. And then there's people who are stupid, and and people, because some people use those words, they the same thing.
Sometimes they're both.
And she doesn't mince words.
It's a Venn diagram.
Well, he's a kid, so they like that word. Because ignorance, like you said, like your children came from the area. Well, they've never seen perhaps a black person before. They didn't know. So that's truly ignorance, when you just don't know. And then there's when you know better, what we're supposed to try to do better, right? As Maya Angelou said, and that's when you're stupid, when you just don't, when you're just not doing the right thing sometimes. And there's also how, because their parents thought that was the right thing. The parents taught them that, when you're taught it, and then so it's teaching them what it is, and that kind of again is very basic, and they get that, and at certain ages, but yeah, finding books that are. If that it's about a kid, but then they have these book series now about anyone is like, I am Abraham Lincoln, and they're made like to look like a little cartoon with the big head, and they're a kid.
Yeah, those are great.
And we have a bunch of the we have a couple on Einstein. He loves Einstein, but through those because they cover history and they cover different things, and but they remain a little kid through the whole book. And even my smart little kid is like, he's a grown up now. Why does he still the kid? And I said, well, because you're a kid, and they want you to relate to the kid and being a kid. And he's like, well, that's just silly. So,
and I will say that like part of it is us as parents relearning our own history, because we have been fed a very narrow explanation of what it is to be in this world, and it's been written from a particular perspective. So, I'll be the first to say I have this conversation all the time, and I know nothing. Like I just stay in that space of like I am a student right alongside my children, and some things need to be re-researched. Some things, some other tools and other resources need to be brought to the table. And Edgar, to your point about having those kind of historical conversations in context, we recently visited the Watts Labor Community Action Center. Yeah. And brilliant space. What? Like, I was like, what? Haven't I been here before? And I remember we walked into the little boat area where they had the slaves, in the boat. And my son just kind of being like, yo, why are all the black people in the boat naked? And what? And having to then think about my response, and this came up earlier in our conversation about not always being so quick to feel like you have the answer. Your answer might be wrong. Like you might want to go back and re-research and put a pause on that conversation. You know what? That is a really great question. Let's talk about that after dinner. Google, And then don't just, Wikipedia. Like, you're going to have to maybe dig a little bit deeper to find some of the answers to the context of the conversation you're trying to have. So I think, a lot of it, too, is like we put a lot of pressure on ourselves as parents to have all of the right answer because you're realizing you're programming little people, and the racism that exists is a programming from big people to little people. So, I get off easy a little bit because my crowd is under 5, right? So what's age appropriate for them, I don't face the same challenges as a university level educator or even a high school or even, your kids that are 10 and 12. Like, I'm just starting to, as a parent of an 8 and a 6-year-old, get to that place where their questions are a little bit more sophisticated. And, the conversation happens, like I said, repeatedly. The conversation I had with my kids at 3 and 4, it's different, but it's the same. And their understanding of what's happening around them is interesting. And, I will say this, too, that sometimes your really well thought out and efficient programming goes awry. And you have to stop, pause, and reframe that conversation again. I'll just share a little anecdote. My daughter, despite the constant conversations that we have about her being beautiful and about her hair and her curly natural hair being beautiful and her brown skin and her brown eyes being beautiful, there's combating the I want yellow hair and blue eyes conversation has been a consistent struggle since she's 3. I don't own one Disney movie in my house, let alone my children somehow miraculously know the words to all the songs. Like, it's just like they go to school and they're indoctrinated with this stuff. And I remember at a certain point, the American Girl doll fad hit, and it was like, oh, no. And of course, she didn't want the doll that looked like her. She wanted the doll that looked like somebody else. And, her father's reaction was to just go hard. All white dolls have to go. Everything's got to go. And she was upset. She, at 4 and a half, she was like, why are you taking away my things? And he was like, nope, we went too lax, we've been too lenient, too much infiltration, we gotta fix this. And so then, didn't think much of it. 2 months later, we're in IKEA, I'm checking them into like the little child thing, and she looks up at a white man, and she's like, my daddy doesn't like peach people. Wow, like, I am like diversity, multicultural queen of education, right? And I'm like, so in that moment, in her 5-year-old mind, I'm like, what do I say? Like, that's not true. But she was upset because her daddy threw out all her peach dolls. That's what she calls white people, because of grandma's peach, right? So he threw out her peach doll. So then I realized in that moment, that she had misinterpreted what was being said through the action of taking away her dolls that didn't look like her and didn't encourage her to have a self-love. And we had to rehab that conversation. And I feel like we rehab this conversation every year in a different way. So
let's open it up to questions, because there is a lot. I mean, one of the things that we haven't even got to yet is kind of, quite often when we talk about conversations around race with our kids, and there are studies that back this up, that it's often parents of color who are having conversations with their kids about race. But what does it mean to be a white parent and having those conversations around race? So I'm just going to open it up to anyone who may have a comment about that. And also, if you have questions, let's hear them.
This is for Angela, actually, going back to your last anecdote. I'm sorry, Rebecca, although Angela, I love you. Rebecca, when your daughter asked for a doll that doesn't look like her, what is your response? My daughter is Black, and we only have Black dolls, which is probably not, like, we should probably have all the cultural dolls, learning things as I go. And we haven't had her ask for a doll that doesn't look like her yet. And I honestly hadn't thought about that. What is the response?
I don't know that I have the right response, to be honest with you. I mean, my response in the moment was, there's no way I'm paying $125 for a doll that doesn't look like you. Like, and that was my response, was, if you want an American Girl doll, you will pick one that looks like you, period. Which probably isn't the right way to go, but that's just the honest to God truth. You know, I think if I was putting on my critical my thinking hat, I would have probably asked why, and just leave it there. Why do you not want a doll that looks like you? Oh well, you know, and then you really get to the root of what's the programming that's running in their own head. You know, is it because they just like? I mean, sometimes we way overthink it, and it's like, well, because she has that pink bow. Like, I want the one with the pink bow, and the other one doesn't have the pink bow, and sometimes it's not really that deep. She just likes that doll better. But it you know, that would be where I would start, is why.
Can I give a response? So I have a similar issue with books. So my daughter, so we don't do American Doll, but she'll read the American Girl books. So, and they don't have that many books with girls of color. It's just, and so I noticed that she'll pick books with, you know, I'll continue to kind of say, oh, look, there's an Asian girl, you know. I like the whole intellectual curator. So we go to the public library every week, and I look for, you know, books that are diverse, especially that look like her. And it's really hard. And when I find them, they're always like Chinatown or something. It's so like exoticized, and I'm like, I don't even want to read this book, you know. So it's pretty disappointing in a lot of ways. But I do try to encourage her. I'll encourage her, but I don't force her. Right, but I always say, oh, this is interesting, and I did notice that after a while, she did start gravitating towards like the American Girl books that were the African American girls, right, and then Latina girls. She read all 5, whatever, you know, girls of color books, but she did do that on her own, right? Because if you force it, then it becomes this like, then it might have a kind of a anti or counterculture, whatever, counter psychological effect, right? So, but I allow her to choose her books, but I continue to kind of make suggestions every week, and eventually she's like probably tired of mommy. She's like, okay, I'll try one, and then she likes it, you know. So,
I wanted to just, if I could say something, because I feel like that's something we're talking about, diversity, and that's something I sometimes feel sensitive about, because it's two separate issues about absolutely you have to have positive representation of your child, and what, you know, and finding things that look like them, because that's something I think even us growing up, there was nothing. We talked about on TV, and it was just Barbie pretty much. But when you even said, like, you know, families of color have these conversations, but white families don't. I remember growing up, and the big thing, now I'm going to age myself, is when I was a kid, and Roots was the big thing, the miniseries, and everybody watched it. You didn't have a DVR, so you had to stay home and get home. I remember having to leave Robinson's May, again, aging myself, well, that doesn't even exist anymore, because we had to get home, and we wanted to see, you know, Roots, and just, whoa, you know, because again, just ignorant. And so that was huge. But that's the thing, is if we really want to have within our family, teaching them about diversity, then I think there should be diversity, this is my opinion, in toys, in dolls. Because when you were saying that, I was kind of going, you know, like, because I've seen that. And again, whatever you know is kind of what you experience and have with your children. But because we adopted a biracial boy, and started an adopted family support group with so many transracial families and white parents who've adopted, you know, Latino children or black children, or we even have some black family that adopted white children. So it's like there's such this multicultural, diverse group of friends that my son is growing up with, that I wouldn't want him to think that there's just only has to be white or black or dolls, which, by the way, this is a whole other conversation. Made sure he had some dolls as a little boy, and don't get me started. I know where he's very strong about pink and purple are not just a girl color, you know. And also raising a boy who's a feminist, which is again a little bit little arm of this conversation. So there's all kinds of things we have to think about for our children. So that's something to think about, you know, as if you're a white family and white children, that's it. I'm so glad you're here. This is awesome. But does your child have only white toys? Books that only represent white? What if they had, you know, books and toys and dolls and things that represented what the world looks like, what their school looks like? I think that's more the way to go, because we want people, and what you're doing, and even in your job, you know, is showing what the world looks like. Right. Not just what our family or our neighbor's family, but the world, right. Our community even.
Right. And if I may, to your question, Miss, is my wife took our daughter to the farmer's market. What's the name of that doll place? The American Girl? Right. But she made it like, to her credit, right? Because she found her this beautiful mocha skin doll, right? She wasn't the indigenous Mexican peasant. It was just a modern girl that happened to have her skin tone. And my wife and my daughter had a lovely Saturday experience when they went down to that store, and it became a fun experience. It didn't become like a Chicano studies lecture about, you know what I mean? Because like sometimes we get real broccoli about righteousness, and it was just a fun Saturday with mommy, and they had a nice lunch and tea, and it was just such a lovely experience that my daughter walked away from that thinking very highly about her doll selection, and oh, she looks like me, and it was cool. So maybe not make it so heavy. It can be part of something fun that she can enjoy with you.
And you know, Joe, I want to just also make a distinction. I think it's one thing to be a white parent of a child of color. It's another thing to be a white family in general with white children, and how you approach this conversation. And I've felt very fortunate to learn a little bit more about, you know, white privilege in the last year, and I've been a part of this group called Parenting for Change, which has members from AWARE and SURGE and, you know, White People for Black Lives, and folks that are actively pursuing the dialogue independent of they're not members of communities of color, but they're at least taking the time to understand their own their own self-identity in the context of these institutional programming and systems that exist, how their children can either become, you know, perpetrators of continuing this legacy, or stand up and say something when their best friend that might look differently from them in class, when somebody says, you know, to your clip from off the boat, like, to be able to feel equipped to have that dialogue in defense of things that they know are unjust. So, I would encourage all white parents to find resources, find communities of support. I mean, as a mixed race woman, like finding multiracial Americans in Southern California, that was like, oh my God, my people, kumbaya, we're all mixed. Let's talk about the distinct, experience of growing up that way. But I encourage all parents to find the resources in their specific community too, to look outside of it so you can learn and see what's happening, but also just own where you are in your own racial identity and learn about how that fits into the context of the greater whole.
Let's take some more questions. There was one here, and then we'll get over here.
My name's Leonard Eisenberg, and I was a teacher for 30 years. I worked in bilingual environments in Europe, and I worked here. I write for City Watch LA, and I must confess that I have a problem with the approach that's been taken tonight, because we've dealt exclusively with the effects and not the causes. Nobody seems to be willing to point up that 63 years after Brown versus Board of Education, LAUSD is still 90% Black and Latino, and that the education you get at Cleveland, a gifted magnet, is not the education you get at Dorsey High School, where if you try to educate Black children to the level that when I teach white children at Palisades High School is expected of me with Socratic method, I get accused by the Black.
What's the question? Because we want to make sure that we get to everybody.
I would like to have, instead of 20 years from now, which I don't think we have, trying to deal with some solutions where Ava DuVernay did a film and talks about 13th. We're filling our prisons with my ex-students because these school systems are turning them loose without basic skills. We are looking at history books of dead white men when we don't have Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States.
Do you have an actual question?
The question is, what do you folks suggest to do to change the game?
That is a great question.
It's a fantastical
question. It's a question that I literally I've been asking myself for the last 3 years. So I don't work in the public education system in this moment, but I just literally had my first sit down with our superintendent for a board supervisor for LUSD to ask specifically that question. What can we do? as parent advocates to create change? Because I honestly don't have the answer. I have a lot of experiences in alternative methodologies that have worked, that I have seen have worked. I've created, camp and auxiliary programming around the education system where I've had those students where people are like, oh, that's the bad kid or that's a troublesome kid. And I've not had one problem with them in my program, because when you meet the child where they're at, when you address their interests and you create an environment that encourages learning, you don't have bad kids. You just have bad systems that don't actually teach the children. So, I live in South LA, and the word on the street is that all of the 11 elementary schools in my area are failing by LAUSD standards, right? And I'm sitting across from my board supervisor, and I'm asking him, or my board person, and I'm like, so you agree that this is what really is happening, that these schools are failing. How can we change the system that exists? How can we knock down the monolith that is this district that doesn't allow for the flexibility in doing all of the things that maybe some of these auxiliary programs are able to afford certain children? How do we provide that to all children? And honestly, sir, I'm looking for an answer.
Well, I'm ever so sorry. We do have to kind of keep moving on. I almost feel like it's a separate event in and of itself, because that is a big and weighty conversation. If we can introduce yourselves and please ask a question. Thank you.
As a parent of 3 little girls, 3 little brown girls, I can tell you from firsthand experience, you have to make a concerted effort to have them, to raise them, to actually feel good about themselves, right? I mean, so based on what was just said now, I want to share a story as a question. I spoke with an old friend of mine who happened to have just actually termed out of the state assembly. He was the author of the ethnic studies bill, and which was a really big deal. But I said to him, his name's Luis Alejo. I said, Luis, what do you think would be harder to do, to accomplish? Pass the ethnic studies bill and have that signed by the governor, or actually remove the Thanksgiving myth from first grade? And he said...
And what's your question?
Well, he said Thanksgiving, to remove that, right? And I say, my question is, that's where it starts. And so essentially the question would be, where do we as parents who actually want to make a concerted effort to raise children of color who are healthy and strong, how do we take that on to actually change it at a systemic level? Because I think that's really what's gone unsaid thus far.
Thank you.
I think I just want to reveal the truth here. I'm homeschooling my son now, because I started off in kindergarten and was not happy. And where we live in the San Fernando Valley, you apply to charter schools, and if you don't get in, because it literally is a lottery, if your name isn't drawn, you have to have alternatives. Now, again, there's so many awesome teachers out there, but their hands are tied. I know they're great schools, so I'm not against school system at all, but I think that it's completely flawed. Well, it's not completely, but very flawed. And so I can speak to why I do what I do, because to help the next generation not repeat the flaws that we have. And I still every day do something I can. I also teach my son that this is also a political issue, not just a race issue. It's an economic issue. I mean, these are, again, he's 7, so I can't go overboard, but we do talk about these things, like that little thing of the thief in Madeline, like starting from there, because, segregation and prejudice, he knows what prejudice means. I mean, these are things we haven't talked about. But one of the things I think is when anyone, and I know we're here to talk about race, but I say, but anyone feels and is raised to feel marginalized, not heard, not valued, no self-esteem, that people are against them, that they go to school and they see the difference comparatively and they know, and then they go to a home where they still aren't able to express that anger, they can't express it out, they can't feel their emotions, they can't cry about it, especially with boys. You talked about the PRISM system. Boys don't cry. I've already showed the video of my son on YouTube, Sesame Street, you should Google it, Rosie Greer, way back in the day, singing "It's okay for boys, it's it's all right for boys to cry. So I believe that's part I'm passionate about, that it starts, like you say, this new generation. We can try from here, but there's still absolutely work we should keep doing, what's going on in the world, but that we need to allow our children to feel their anger. We need to allow their children to be pissed off about what they see, what they don't like, and we need to not be afraid of it. We need to let them cry. We need to let them see us feeling that way too. Let them know that we are outraged by what's happening. I think that's key. We want to change it. And what can we do? And I'm trying to change it. I want him to see me trying to make changes. I want him to know how I feel. So he will go on to do that. I think for me, that's one thing. I mean, there's many, many things, obviously, but that's one thing.
Let's take another couple of questions.
Hi, my name is
And
Erin.
I'm sorry, please keep it to a question.
We'll talk afterwards in the parking lot
Yes.
if y'all need to talk, or we'll change numbers. Give us
I do have a two-part question. One is in the conversation of identity and physical appearance, and for people of color trying to build that confidence. What are your recommendations in terms of also building out the professional opportunities? I feel like that's also a big one. The other half of the question related to the work is about, there was mention of it tends to be the families of color that are having the race conversations. I feel like it also tends to be the people of color who are in occupations to further break down the racial systems that exist that also tend to pay less. And so kind of how do you guys navigate that to help them feel the responsibility to make the world a better place, but to not economically suffer because of it?
If I may, I thank you for asking that question. I think when we first adopted our daughter, what do you want to be when you grow up, baby? I want to be a hairstylist. That's what she said, right? Lovely little, that's what she had seen. And through raising her and seeing my wife wear a business suit and going to work, and when she plays pretend now, we take her to a boardroom and she's in front of a computer and she's ordering things. Right? It's just to be able to empower her with like, hey, she's pre-wired to be a leader, and as a woman of color, to empower her and to give her like credibility for that aspiration, to say this can happen because mommy can do it, and to be able to say that. To your other question, you're absolutely right. As a professional person of color that's been working the nonprofit circuit and trying to usher this change, you're absolutely right. The premium is not there, right? And until, it's kind of like teaching. We don't put a premium on teachers, unfortunately, and we don't compensate them the way they should. So as a society, we haven't really put a premium on this, right? On investing in change agents that help institutions. So that's a bigger, challenging question. You're right, and to how do we educate? How do we inspire our children to say you can still pursue that career and have economic benefits that can help you positively in your life? It's gonna take a little bit of work.
And you addressed the question in the beginning about confidence. I mean, I'm going to go back to
Actually,
looking
I'm
on my
sorry,
table.
Angie, to cut you. I'm going to let Nancy
yes.
jump in because she's been waiting very, very patiently. And we're going to take another question.
I just want to say, in terms of diversity, and so I just read an article, actually, exactly what you said, that women and people of color are actually dinged for doing diversity work, whereas white men are not actually dinged for diversity work. So I was talking with a colleague of mine, and we were just talking about how do we do diversity work, and we talked about partnering, right, having allies and coming alongside. And one of the things that we're trying to convince our university to hire more diversely, and one of the kind of convincing arguments in terms of hiring more diversity, of hiring more people of color and women, is that diverse ideas is good for business, right? It actually, it helps people work harder, it generates more ideas, it actually generates more income, not to only take a capitalistic approach, but this is what, we're in a capitalistic society, right? So that's one way to kind of encourage, and also research shows that diversity, you actually have to have people who are dedicated to hiring, like people that are solely, that their whole jobs is to make sure that the company is going to hire more diversely. Otherwise, if you just do kind of implicit bias training, that stuff actually doesn't work. That you actually have to have quotas. People hate that word, but unless you actually make space for people of color and women, those spaces won't exist because people will by their implicit biases, hire people that look just like them, right? And in terms of systemic, I just wanted to say something about the systemic organization of what we can do on a systemic level. So I'm totally empathetic to all the kind of, we need to get at the root cause. And I think that what we can do as, if you're, I'm assuming we're all taxpayers here, you can go and organize with other parents or just other concerned citizens and go, the school boards are elected, right? So you want to elect school board members who will go ahead and implement ethnic studies or whatever it is, curriculum, right? So you need to, as parents, we do need to take, parents and citizens, we need to take more political action in terms of our public school boards and public school systems, so.
Let's take one more question and then we're going to get some closing comments and some tips of things that you can actually do tomorrow with your kids. Yes.
Hi, my name is Amber, and I'm a mother of, 4 kids, but 3 of my kids are white males. So we're one of those families who are trying to educate ourselves. Thank you so much for speaking to that about me learning along with my kids. What I'm finding is challenging is keeping the emotional, empathetic. We do all of that, of course, but my 7-year-old is gotten some armor already. So he's already putting up walls. So I wouldn't care if someone said that to me or, whatever he might say. So I find myself coming down hard. It's not acceptable. You can't say that, or you know what I mean? That's being a bully. But then I'm worried that's stopping the conversation. So I guess I'm having a hard time being empathetic with him. I'm wondering if you have some suggestions about how to help him see it from a different perspective without shaming him, which I'm finding is hard to do. But also being emotionally honest myself and for my husband as well, not letting him know that it matters to us. Anyway, yeah.
Who'd like to take that?
Well, I would address, first of all, I want to say I feel your love for your child and I'm empathetic to your feelings. But think about because your reaction, I know it comes from a place of fear, because I know we as parents, we think when they do one thing, that's going to affect their whole future and they're going to end up getting hurt, harmed. These are all legitimate fears, absolutely. But then again, turning around, and I know it comes from love, but there's other ways he can express himself other than just words. A lot of times when I'm asked or someone's asked a question, depending on the personality, you can't just come up with the words. So he has his wall up. You have to find the way to let him express himself, whether it's through art, whether it's if he's angry, not even about what you want him to be angry about. Whenever you think he might be angry, there's ways today my son was angry at me, funny enough, and I just let him rip paper. There's, like I said, there's a way he has to, if he's got to block something in there, that he's not expressing himself, we let our son punch this huge stuffed animal we got that we loved at its first birthday. It was so big. What are you going to do with it? It's a godsend, because he can punch the bleeping heck out of that thing when he's really angry. We don't hit people. We don't hit ourselves. We don't hurt people. Like I say, ripping things. Sometimes when he's just frustrated and angry, he will shake a snow globe and then watch it calm down, knowing that this will pass. So anything that you can, does he show anger when he get angry? Okay, well, there you go. That's a way to get to it, because then what happens, when we let go of anger, we all remember, we get angry sometimes. There's that, because what happens, we get this surge of hormones. Because part of the reason also I do peaceful parenting, and it's based in science. It's all about brain development, child brain development. So it got my husband on board too, because it really was there's proof to this. So it's the hormone surge that he gets, and then all of a sudden they're relaxing. Sometimes with no words, if he's quiet, you know what? Can I just hug you? How old is he? You have older ones? He's 7. There is this proven thing, if you hug a child for 20 seconds, a 20-second hug, physical contact for 20 seconds releases oxytocin in our brain. And oxytocin is the happy love hormone that we all want when we eat chocolate too sometimes. But it's that we went through a phase where my son would be angry at me again, but he'd come in because we started practicing the happy hug, we called it. And he'd get on my lap, mad at me, but then he'd want that hug. And we'd count to 20, and it always ended up being longer than 20 seconds. And it physically will calm you. So there are ways you can do that will build this connection, will build this trust, that eventually he might just out of the blue mention something that happened a day ago. And that's usually the best time also to talk about things, when they're not fraught in the emotion, where you're not in it, when he's not in it. Sometimes when you're driving in the car, because they can't get away, they got the seatbelt on, and just matter-of-factly bring up what happened yesterday. If that helps any, does that direct to your question at all? If not, again, grab me at the parking lot. I'm happy to talk to you more because I know we won't have time, but hope
Yes,
so.
I do
Okay.
want to, there is, whenever we do events like this, there's just so much that we could talk about. Literally, we could be here until midnight. I think that Charlotte would tell us off, so we are going to have to start wrapping it up. This is going to be on the website at kpcc.org/in-person. This is being live streamed. You'll be able to take this, share it with your friends, continue the conversation, share comments on Facebook, Twitter, all of that. This really is just the start of the conversation, not the complete one. But I'm going to start at the opposite end. Nancy, what advice or what tip would you share with anyone who says, okay, I'm ready to go home and have a conversation with my child about race? What is the one thing that you would suggest that they do?
Wow, okay. I think that the way I approach it is, again, organically, where I take prompts from the child or things like what you said, just things that we have around the house, right? If books or whatever, or activities where I was sympathetic to what someone said about, like, if I would speak from my own experience, right? My own thoughts and talk about stories from my past. Kids are really attuned to that, right? They like to hear stories about how we grew up. So if I experienced something that was racist, then I would share that as a starting point rather than kind of, again, no preachy, but testimonial, like kind of storytelling, right? I think that's what kids are drawn to, so.
Angela.
Same question? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I will tell him what you did last night. Tell them where you went and why you went, because it's so important to me, and because I love you, come from a place of love, and I love our world, and I want it to be a better place, and again, personalize it and let them know where you came and what we talked about and what you got from it. And again, as a parent, don't be afraid, like we talked about, to not know the answers, and let's learn together. That's one of the things where I always say, I don't know, let's go find out. Luckily, there is a thing, like you say, we got Google, YouTube. And as a homeschooler, I'm constantly learning things with him. I have a t-shirt that says, my child is my greatest teacher. And that applies to, I think, all of us. If we keep that open mind, that open heart to constantly, as you said, Rebecca, keep learning and growing. But that's what I would start. Tell them why you were here, where you went, and just starting the conversation and see what happens. And speak from your heart and your truth and paths, and I think you'll be surprised.
Rebecca, a slightly different question for you, kind of with your classroom hat on. How would you advise parents to work with schools when it comes to educating kids or talking to kids about race?
Well, we are our children's advocates, right? Learning starts at home. And I was just at an event, well, not just, but recently at an event at CAM, and David Banner put it kind of perfectly. And I was like, oh, if you want to start a movement, just move. Like, if you want to shift the needle, move, shift, do something. Whether that's educating yourself, whether that's opening the dialogue with your kids or with other people, whether, whatever tools you need, find them online. I think parents, we don't utilize the power that we have to be change agents in this system. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't necessarily have the answer of how we do that. I think if I had it or anybody had it, it'd have been done, right? But it's incumbent upon us to be our children's fiercest advocate, to put them in an environment that works for them, to hold other adults accountable for the information and the education that they're getting. And, in my case, necessity is the mother of invention. If I don't find it, I'll create it myself. And that's what I do. I create educational programming that's reflective of my values so that my children have access to the things that I think are important. So, homeschooling is one way that I see a lot of parents do that. Unfortunately, that takes their kids out of the system. Charter schools, there's also a huge argument around whether or not that is detrimental, but I think every child has the right to learn, and I think as their parents, there's nobody that's going to advocate for them better than we can.
Mr. Aguirre.
I would say for me, all the advice these ladies shared is fantastic. I would only add, it's like a game of hopscotch, right? Like you're doing this, you got to find when to jump in, right? It's kind of like instead of, I'm going to do a treatise on race and justice. It's like, No, my kids are laughing and they're like, oh, our dog happens to be black. It's like, oh, the dog's black. And Alan's like, oh, that's racist, sister. Like, ah. And they start like, and then jump in when that silly conversation, like, what do you mean by, like, no, that's not, dude, she is a black dog. Well, what do you mean? Like, well, like, just follow the trail. They'll lead you in that conversation. And I think for me, the instances where I feel like my wife and I have really advanced the conversation with them is we jumped on their little bandwagon and whatever little playful conversation they're having. Instead of, let's eat our vegetables and talk about justice. No, it's let's follow the trail. Let them share their insights into their day and then go off on a comical riff. And before we know it, we're talking about equity. We're talking about justice in an organic way without being preachy. I think that's the little bit that I've learned. And then whenever I get into my little loquacious state and I'm losing my audience, like, shut up. just be quiet. Save the conversation for another day. You don't have to cram in everything, all the morals into one conversation. You lost your audience? Cool. You'll live to fight another day.
All right. Before we all lose you, on that note, we will say thank you to our panel tonight. Edgar Aguirre, Director of Talent Development and Inclusion at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Rebecca Bernard, co-founder of World City Centre. Angela Sanders, parent coach.
Sanders, just so you know, Sanders.
It's my accent, actually.
I'm sorry.
That's how we say it, Sanders.
Oh, I love it. So sorry.
Parent coach at Evolving Parents, and Nancy Wang Yuen, chair and association, actually, is that right? Associate professor, thank you, of sociology at Biola University. She's also the author of Real Inequality, Hollywood Actors and Racism. My thanks to all of you, and my thanks to all of you as well.